Uh, I'd like to welcome all of you to another meeting of the Faculty Mentoring Faculty Program. My name is Andy Jones, and I teach here at UC Davis for the University Writing Program and for Technicultural Studies, and every summer for the English department. Therefore, I'm very pleased to introduce Jack Hicks as a colleague, as well as an intellectual hero of mine. He was one of my professors when I was a graduate student here at UC Davis. And very much as we've just been talking about off camera, there are helicopters circling UC Davis. There's yellow police tape at different parts of campus. I'd say definitely revolution is in the air, and therefore it's entirely appropriate for me to introduce Jack Hicks on March 5th, when he's someone who focuses on teaching, focuses on making genuine and authentic connections with his students, and also brings to teaching much of the humor and wit that those of us who know him well know that he shares in conversation. And therefore, if we can call these revolutionary ideas here at a Research One University, I'd like to introduce our local revolutionary, Jack Hicks from the English department. Jack.
First of all, the category of Research One no longer exists.
Okay.
You should be aware of that. That's ancient nomenclature, and I think it's completely inappropriate that I be in any way referred in any way to, as a revolutionary. It occurs to me that Andy Jones has a particular talent for grinding people down, for asking them to do things over and over until they finally, as we all do, say, okay. And then we forget, and then he reminds us that you said, and these would be good dates. And then gradually you realize that you've been boxed in by your own willingness. It helps also that I've asked Andy for help in teaching a couple of my own courses. I oversee the graduate students who teach the Introduction to Creative Writing in Fiction and Poetry. We offer 22 sections of this course a year, and of English 5F and 5P. And it's a delightful course because it satisfies absolutely no requirements within the university, but it's always full with a waiting list. And I think that the role of what I call studio arts in the university is very important for aspiring conductors and musical performers and writers and studio artists. I think that a modern university must have a place for the arts and those who aspire to the arts, and are not necessarily going to be people who are practitioners of the arts beyond the freshman or sophomore year. I think it's an important part of our humanities and our humanistic education. It occurred to me this morning when I was feeling particularly mortal, primarily because even by my standards I'm informal because I have to go to the DMV this afternoon. And the DMV at the end of Broadway, where all of the problems in Northern California end up going to in Sacramento. It should say above the facade, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. But I decided that my own version of hazmat clothing or Hurt Locker clothing, sweatpants, would be appropriate to go and stand in line. It also occurred to me that I will have finished 40 years here, which is pretty shocking to me. It's gone by in a flash, and one of the things one should learn, as some of you who are my senior colleagues, is never in a meeting to make a pronouncement or to offer to do anything. About 6 or 7 years ago, at a meeting in which my then dean was present, I allowed as how I was concerned that senior faculty was losing touch with our undergraduates. And I said I didn't think that it was a particularly good idea for senior faculty to be teaching freshman composition, because I was not sure that many of us had been trained to do it, or it may well have that our own training was so arcane that it was no longer appropriate for this generation of students. I felt pleased that I'd occupied the ethical high ground, and I was ill prepared when she came rushing up and said, "I'm so glad to hear you say that. I have just the opportunity for you." And you know, when someone is allowing you to have an opportunity, or is telling you that your misery is a challenge. Whenever I tell students, well, that's going to be your challenge, isn't it? We know for the code talk means that you're the one whose ox is being gored, not mine. And I said, what? Well, she was my dean, and I was up for a merit increase. And I said, well, what did you have in mind? And she said, I'd like you to teach a course in the humanities program. I said, oh? And I was quite happy. I didn't look forward to greater opportunities or more challenges. I like the status quo. And I said, what do you have in mind? And she said, I would like you to find a way to do what you do, which is 3 of my 5 courses a year are in literature of California or culture of California in some way, so that I've become a Californiaist in this 3rd stage of my own career. And I said, let me get this straight. You want me to teach a large humanities class? And she said, yeah, and I want you to teach it to freshmen, the first quarter on their arrival on campus. And I said, and the murkiness of the picture became clear. And I thought immediately, why on earth did I allow myself the short-term ethical pleasure of occupying the high ground when I should have known that it would result in more work and a kind of having to actually put into place a view that I espoused? Well, the fact is, I do think that we in the University of California have become increasingly separated from new generations of students. And while I may have particular beliefs that critical reading and the art of writing may not have the roles that they had 40 years ago, it doesn't necessarily mean that I want to set forward to correct them. What is certainly true in my mind is that this generation of students has very different interests and very different talents than those students who did 40 years ago. I speak both as a faculty member and as a parent. I have a daughter who's graduating from high school. I find it nice that if I have any question about technology, she can handle it. She'll be impatient. She seems to regard my questions as questions that have to do with the use of ATMs, where I see them as quite technologically charged. Her generation is very different than generations that were here when I came in. So that I began talking with a group of graduate students because my ulterior motive is always to try to get them to do most of the work as a condition of their getting a PhD, a dissertation that I sign. And also they often have, they've not learned yet to keep their mouths shut, and they have some of the best ideas. I find that one of the pleasures intellectually for me is that some of my most interesting and fascinating ideas come from graduates and undergraduate students. They just do. It's really neat. And I have no qualms about appropriating those as my own. So we began talking about the fact that my large literature of California classes, I'm doing one now, and by large I mean within the university they're not large, they're 80, and I keep them that way. I understand that you may have taught courses of 300, 400, or 500, which are truly large. And the only reason they're kept to 80 in the English department is because that limits the number of teaching assistants they have to assign. It's not a question of how many the course would draw. The course, when it's offered, closes the very first day that it's available electronically, which is fine with me because I've taught great big courses, and It's not very gratifying for me. I'm an inveterate snoop. I'm curious about students. I learn a great deal about them. I ask questions of them. I asked a student yesterday who happened to be passing by in the hall who did beautifully on the mid-quarter, got a 98. And these mid-quarters that I give now are niggling and require a close knowledge of the text, their identification, and it's impossible to fake it. I began grilling him about classes he took. He's a non-major, and asking what other courses he took. He allowed us how he couldn't take many courses because he worked full-time for a state agency. I thought, a state agency? And what would that might be? He said, well, the State Franchise Tax Board. And I said, do you try to hide that? He said, I've been booed in classes when I let that be known. But I began talking with him, and I was very curious about his experience in a state now that it seems to be in great fiscal peril. And the irony of his having been furloughed, perhaps the only state institution that does indeed bring money in, he has been forced to take a 14% reduction in salary, and they reduce the amount of time he serves. But I'm curious about that. One of my students suggested that in literature of California, one recurrence in California is certainly the unexpected, and the fact that we are a boom and bust state. We have been from the beginning. That was our origins are in the discovery of gold, and that boom and bust has been a regular sine wave pattern in the economic development of California, the demographic development of California, and in every way possible that you can imagine. And I said, okay, let's just do crises and disasters. Let's come up with something that looked like it would be suitable fare for tabloids. And the staff in my department took me seriously and did this garish poster. I had to stop her from the first version because it was even more garish. There were more bodies, for example. And we identified really in this course for freshmen and non-majors 3 areas that I thought would be appropriate as kind of little model areas where the large could grow from the small. 3 issues that would be that would deal with the abilities of any that I think are important for any citizen of the state studying the humanities. The ability to analyze information from disparate areas, to synthesize it, to become familiar enough with it to analyze it, and to communicate it in written or in some other form. And I decided when I began thinking about what it is to be a citizen of California, what might be the cruxes of recurring problems that make the state unique. I don't like particularly, I am aware that my colleagues feel that when you study the local or regional that you're guilty of provincialism. And that's their problem, not mine. If one thinks that one studies something that is located in a distant land or a foreign country, that it's more sophisticated or international, it's a way of thinking that I find truly provincial. But I wanted to begin thinking, what is it that what areas would I locate that have from the beginning and continue to challenge students when they come in that perhaps they have not examined. One of the things I also did was to begin, since I was already in this war, I thought I may as well get to know the enemy, if you will. So I volunteered for summer advising. Those 2-day trips when new admittees to the university come, and I was at the end of the day the faculty who would address 300 of them. And even more interesting, the next day, address their parents, which I find really fascinating, and continue to do it. I wanted to do it because I thought that I might have something of value to say to them, but as much I wanted to know more about them as a group. I was curious about the students that we were admitting, and I wanted to see them from the get-go. One of the areas that recurs in my own larger classes, Literature of California. I also teach smaller classes, say the Film and Fiction of Los Angeles, which I think is very interesting because it allows me to deal with the urban region as a character and narrative, whether it's written or cinematic or artistic. One of the things that it seemed to me that was a certainty was that the geologic nature of citizenship in California is something that over which we have no control and is a check that has been written and will be cashed. We are as geologically active as any other state except for Alaska or Hawaii. And the particular nature of Hawaii's geologic activity tends to be volcanic. I was interested in what is it like to live in a state that is riddled with faults. What's it like to live in a state in which the major university in the state, major public university in the state, has a fault running right underneath it, or at least the stadium does. The Hayward Fault runs right under the football stadium at UC Berkeley. And it also runs right underneath a nearby nuclear laboratory in which radiation is used. But I wanted to, one of the first questions I ask of students is, how many of you have been through an earthquake? And fully 2/3 of them have. How many of you have been through an earthquake in which property was severely damaged or someone was injured? And a surprisingly large proportion. I've been through 2 earthquakes, and the first one was so terrifying that I reverted to a kind of rat brain and just ran around the room. But I was curious as to know what is it that defines this state geologically, tectonically, and hydrologically. And furthermore, how can I take it out of the realm of the theoretical? I mean, it's very nice to look at maps of the San Andreas Fault from the Salton Sea all the way up until off the coast of Mendocino. It's very nice to know about the Hayward Fault, which runs through the Bay Area. But how can I make this even more visible? I had the opportunity at one time to take a tour of the area around Santa Cruz with a very good geologist named Gary Griggs. And Griggs said, I said, you know, I have trouble visualizing beyond a map or pictures the San Andreas Fault. Oh, he said, no problem. We got in his truck and he drove me down into a valley and there was a huge shear and he said, here, put your hand on this. This is the San Andreas Fault. And it stunned me that that was the moment where I could touch the fractal shifting between 2 huge geologic masses. A little later, a colleague of some of yours, Eldridge Moores, whom you may know, Eldridge said that, who was one of the fathers of plate tectonics, said that really geology is a question of arriving at narratives to understand things that happened millions of years ago. I was also interested in the fact, since I was an immigrant to California and lived in places that really had seasons, you know, we had fall and winter and spring and summer. There were such phenomena as regular thunder showers. Leaves fell. They had all the earmarks of what I took to be natural. And yet I had moved when I came from the East Coast to a place in which there was wet and dry, cool and blistering hot. There were times when rainfall fell in such astonishing abundance that it flooded areas or could result in snowpacks 4 or 5 or 6 feet deep at one point, so that when there was water, there was too much water. When there wasn't water, there was never enough. I, for example, would love to hear that day when someone says on the newscast, we have more than 100% of our annual precipitation, both in snowpack and reservoir storage. We're going to be okay for the next year. We have, according to the authorities, 107% of the typical snowpack at this time of the year. But it will never be enough. I think it's like money to Warren Buffett. There will never be enough riches. Or Bernie Madoff, for whom there was never enough, quite. So I began thinking about how can I get at both the combination of tectonic volatility and the peculiar relationship of water in a state in which only one river remains undammed. That's the Smith River up by the Oregon border. All the others have been hydrologically engineered. And what I was curious about was what could happen when finally we know that it's not a question of when we're going to have an 8.0 earthquake, or if, but when. What could happen if there was a simultaneous earthquake that could cause a collapse of the hydrologic system? A friend of mine in geology, in water science, Jeff Mounts, said, that's not hypothetical. That is going to happen. And he referred me to a visiting writer at that time named Mark Reisner, who had written the single best book on water in the West called Cadillac Desert. Reisner's scenario was that at that time, that a very little known area in California called the Sacramento Delta was so fragile. It was a series of 80 teacup islands that were protected by levees that were often made of dirt, auto bodies, mattress springs. I saw them building them. That the Hayward Fault tremor, a moderate tremor, could cause those levees to begin to fail, and one by one those islands would fail. The salt water would move down through Sassoon, up the Sacramento River, and the result of a moderate earthquake on the Hayward Fault would be to destroy that very delicate system of islands in the delta, inundating the area, destroying farmland, and furthermore causing the giant pumps that are 40 miles away that pump 40% of the water that Southern California uses at the Warren O. Banks, I think it is, pump, to stop electronically, because once saline level reaches a certain point, you can't pump saline water south. What could happen if there was such a disaster? So the first part is built around Mark Reisner's book called A Dangerous Place, in which students are asked to explore, not merely hypothetically, what it is to live in a tectonic and hydrologically volatile and engineered system, but what will happen if that fails, and to look at it close up. 20 years ago, for me, the Sacramento Delta, I knew primarily because of exotic things like the town of Locke, or a restaurant that some of you may have visited called Al-the-Wops, or Al-the-Wops. That, pardon me?
You know what the WAP stands for?
What?
Without papers. It's
Without
for Italian
papers?
immigrants.
Really? I did not know that. I know that, you know, there are dollar bills on the ceiling, and I've eaten their peanut butter and jelly and pasta lunches, and had some libations there. But I think that one of the things that's happened in all of our lifetimes has been an increasing sense of the crucial significance of that little honeycomb of islands called the Sacramento Delta, not merely as an exotic place that time forgot, but as a place in which the small had truly national or statewide and national significance. So that yes, we talk about slip strike faults. Yes, we talk about tsunami. It is a constant disappointment to my students, for example. One told me this past fall that he felt that in some way deprived that California had not had a decent-sized tsunami since 1964. And I said, perhaps if you live long enough, my son, we'll have a tsunami and you can feel that experience. Until then, you may have to watch it on CNN. The tsunami in 1964 was from an Alaska earthquake, and it destroyed the town of Crescent City. But I wanted to explore, on one hand, territory about our citizenship that was scientific in nature, and to undertake with my own scientific training and experts to explain the what of where we live, the how of where we live, and what would likely happen when the ground beneath our feet and the rivers that flowed past us would be altered, because they had been altered again. I should say from the beginning that when I hear someone tell someone else, a professional, well, it's too complex for me to explain, it creates a certain rage inside me. That, to me, suggests either intellectual laziness, contempt for the listener, or lack of real comprehension. I think that as a real intellectual or educator, you should be able to explain to the educated layperson what you're talking about. And if you can't, then there may be a problem in motive, desire, or ability. And as public educators, I think it's politically wise for us to do that as a university. The second area that I deal with is the simple fact that California has been, from the beginning, the most diverse, demographically diverse planet in the country, and I think it's been an absolutely noble experiment. My own feeling is that democracy itself has been a noble experiment, and I think it's madness to attempt to export it. I think that we're one of a kind, and there are times that I despair at whether it's working or not. Currently, politically, the impasse that we're faced with makes you think that Rodney King wasn't so far off when he asked, can't we all just get along? Perhaps we can't, because we seem to inhabit different planets. What was true of California was that from the beginning, with the original more than 100 tribes that occupied the territory before it was called California, the establishment of the 21 missions up the spine of California by the Spanish government, the sacred expedition undertaken by the soldiers and priests, which was an extension of the missions that they had set up, more than 30 in Baja. When they did those missions, it was because it had worked to occupy and establish Baja. But from one of the things I had noticed from coming from the East was that this was a state that was far more demographically diverse than anything I had ever seen. As a kid growing up in a steel mill town in Baltimore, Maryland, there were black people and white people. And when you ask someone about ethnicity, I once had a dean at a junior college where I taught tell me, well, you know, so-and-so is an Italian. And I just thought, this is not what we're talking about in terms of ethnic diversity. It's not like you don't get points for being under 120 pounds or gray or from Italian descent. What I recognized, even as a very young faculty coming to California, was that the ethnicity of California was much more pronounced. I look, for example, now at the faces of students in my classes. It's an entirely different ballgame than it was 40 years ago. I noticed, for example, that most recently I have Vietnamese, Hmong, Mien students. I have not merely Latino Chicano, but Central American students. And California has been defined by the waves, the lamina of migrants, immigrants, sojourners, and political refugees. That has been the way in which the state has been composed. It's been both a strength and a real challenge, and an ongoing political struggle, so that I deal with the conditions, the historical development of demographic diversity, and the problems, the strengths and problems that creates. And I do that through a second book that I'll pass some of these out, that I think is sensational, called Crossing Over by Ruben Martinez. It's an absolutely sensational nonfiction book. It's been made into a documentary about a family from a particular Mexican village that came to America and goes back. Martinez happened to see a clipping of an incident outside San Diego where some coyotes were attempting to outrun migras in a van, and there was a terrible accident in which a number of illegal immigrants being smuggled in were killed, 3 of whom were from the same family, and he identified the village that regularly people left from, came here to work, and then went back often. And so that I use that as the core text, and we address issues of diversity in a variety of ways. I often use also films. This time around I used a popular recent film called Crash. I've used a wonderful film of a stage play by Luis Valdez called Zoot Suit. That's a marvelous production to bring to life those conditions. And occasionally we'll show students more comic treatments. A Day Without a Mexican, if you've not seen that, is well worth seeing. Or more sobering treatments about, for example, in my Literature of California class, I'm teaching a book by a very good writer who works for the LA Times, a Guatemalan immigrant named Hector Tobar. And Tobar, not long ago, I heard give a talk about the problems of the surge of Central American migration that has brought 600,000 to 1 million Central American immigrants into the greater Los Angeles area, many of whom were fleeing a 36-year war, civil war in Guatemala. More than 200,000 people were killed in that war, many of whom were disappeared in Guatemala, and 5 out of 6 of those killed were Mayan in ancestry, killed by paramilitaries or U.S.-backed military groups. What Tobar was talking about as Guatemalan was Los Angeles as a political refuge and the unique problems that Central American migration caused. For example, a particularly virulent group called Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, which is one of the most violent ethnic gangs in the United States at present. So that I wanted to deal with what it was like in a state that 2 years ago became a majority-minority state. We're no longer a bunch of white guys who are in charge. Good, bad, who cares? It's just that we have a particular demographic identity. The last thing I wanted to deal with was perhaps the question of the image of California, because a lot of people see California as a place where anything goes, and certainly we have been a state that historically has been suspicious of socializing institutions from the beginning. We have been a state that in the early 20th century, during the Progressive era, passed the most liberal initiatives and laws that allow for recall. In many states, there is no provision for recalling an elected official. You can impeach them. You can charge them. But in California, it's quite easy to recall a governor. By easy, I mean the numbers of taxpayer signatures required is a very low proportion of the overall population. As well, it's very easy to qualify a referendum to be placed on the ballot or in an initiative. My own feeling now is I will sign nothing on any clipboard outside my supermarket. Unfunded referenda or initiatives I consider satanic. And furthermore, I consider them as simply the hidden hand of special interests. But I wanted to deal with what it was like to live in a state in which perhaps the boundaries of that which is socially approved are fuzzy often, particularly the boundaries that reach into our religious, spiritual, or social lives. Which, to get to the point, I wanted to look at cults in California. One man's cult is another man's religion. You mentioned the word Scientology in this state. They're one of the largest property owners in the city of Los Angeles, by the way. Some people say that's a cult. Well, the IRS says it's a religion, and so does the California State Franchise Tax Board. What's interesting to me is, has California been really been a breeder reactor for all kinds of forays into religions and cults? When I started out, I used as a model the Manson family, and that became too grisly. And even though my students got to know a great deal about Charles Manson, for example, they got to know that Manson could not receive mail. They got to know that Manson has been denied parole for 14 times. They got to follow, as one student did, his career in the penal system that took him all over the place before he found a home in Corcoran now. They got to know, for example, that he once refused to attend a parole hearing because he was, quote, working on his website. Charles Manson no longer has a website, shortly after that was revealed. But I was very curious about cults. And one of the things that I came to understand also was that in one particularly infamous cult activity, UC Davis had a special standing. When more than 900 people committed mass suicide in the jungles of Guyana, having been led by a church leader in San Francisco who became very politically prominent and socially prominent, Reverend Jim Jones. It turned out that 3 members of the People's Temple happened to be from the family of a campus minister that some of you may have known at that time. And it was very interesting to me that when 17-year-olds come in or 18-year-olds come in, they have a world in which there is black and white and there's right and wrong, and oh, I'd never do that. One of the things I ask them is, when we're talking about the Donner Party, is, are you capable of cannibalism? And a lot of people say, no, that's disgusting. Others will say, I think under the right conditions, yeah, and their people next to them will look at them. One of the things we explore, what's the nature of a cult? Why has California been so regular in allowing cults to flourish? And what happened in that family when the father of 3 of those kids who joined the cult, 2 of whom died in Guyana, was a campus minister, a respected member of this community? And the book I use for that is by one of the surviving members of the cult, Deborah Layton, who was the first-hand member of the People's Temple and escaped 1 month before Jim Jones forced people to commit ritual suicide. I liked the fact that the cult was specifically local, regional. And I like the fact that one of the survivors of that family, now teaches at UC San Diego and specializes in cult behavior. And I wanted to raise the question of really of what were the conditions under which people entered a cult? What kinds of people did? How did the cult perform? At what point would you say yes or no? Could you put yourself in their shoes? One of the questions that I ask on my final exam for that class is I ask the students to propose, I give them a narrative and say, and it asks them to imagine themselves as members of a cult. What led you there? What does it offer you? Do you feel that your group has been treated properly in the media? So that I connect those three areas. First of all is the geologic nature of the state and citizenship, the demographic history of the state and its present recipe, if you will, and the state as a place in which doing one's own thing, being an improvisational entrepreneurial state that from the beginning privileged finding one's individual riches or one's individual happiness to the exclusion often to the social common, continues down to the present. So that I wanted to look at what was under our feet, what was nearby in terms of that seemed to be picturesque but was menacing, as small and as backwater as it seemed, and what happened when something that started out as such an optimistic exercise turned into a nightmare, and what can you learn from the activities of people just like you and the choices they made? So that's what happened with the class. It continues to fill up. It's interesting. It started out as a class of, I had, 120 people, 150 people. And it occurred to me more and more that I was tired of having an aircraft carrier. I didn't like having 4 TAs or 5 TAs. I didn't like all the apparatus. It just, the thrill was gone. So I gradually reduced it by weaseling and fiat to about 80, and it's going back up to 90 next year. What I had wanted it to be was a class that was exclusively limited to freshmen. I found in the past couple of years that by the time it comes time for freshmen to enroll during the summer electronically, that 35 or 40 students had already enrolled for the class. And there was no way for me to forbid a junior or senior from taking the class. So that while the idea was to create a humanities class that cut across disciplines, that was indeed interdisciplinary, that asked students to explore material from a variety of areas, and it asked freshmen in their first quarter at UC Davis to do that. I found increasingly that 40% of the class was upper class. And and there was no way to get around that. There are ways electronically you can stop enrollment at a certain point in order to let the first pass for incoming freshmen to come in. But essentially, my belief was that from the beginning, I enjoyed the challenge and found it interesting to teach humanities to non-majors. I think that as someone teaching in the humanities, I think we make a dire mistake when our mission becomes to turn out majors or graduate students. I think it's, and I'll say this on camera, I think it's a problem when in dire fiscal times the large departments continue to admit the same numbers of graduate students when their placement rate, that is, if our purpose is to reduplicate ourselves and turn out college teachers, when you're looking at 10, 12, 15% placement rate, you could never do business if you sold sandwiches or a car or even a foreign language tape with that kind of return. My own feeling is that I think it's, for me, much more interesting to teach. I teach graduate students in my own department. I work with graduate students. I direct PhDs. But I also really enjoy the experience of seeing non-majors, both freshmen who really don't know what they want to do, and seniors who finally have the time to wander outside their buildings and take a class and ask me directly, if I take this class, is this going to wreck my GPA because I'm trying to get into med school? I'm not sure I can answer that, but I welcome students who ask such a question.
Let's clap for Jack and then ask him some questions. Thank you very
When
much, Jack.
Andy, I like Andy, when Andy said, you know, we haven't had anybody who just comes and talks to people and does it kind of the old-fashioned way, and I thought, my God, I feel like I'm vaudeville or the 8-track tape, or there's that something that time has passed by. I'd welcome your help.
How would you teach your class of 80 students if you had 20 hours of a reader or a TA?
Well, I do have 20 hours of a reader or TA.
Why?
Yeah.
Not 4.
No, I don't think bigger is better.
Okay, you have taught the class of 80.
I've taught this class of 150 as well.
With
I
one
teach
TA.
I taught 150 with 4 TAs.
That's what I asked. Yeah.
One of the things I do is I do some of the grading. I mean, for example, I have colleagues who do not do any of their own grading. The TA does it all. My feeling is that in my current class of 77 people, I will read at least one of their assignments myself, one of their 3 or 4 assignments.
Question. How would you teach it if you just had one TA?
Well, I did that this past fall with one TA, and this is the way I taught it. It was really an anomalous course structurally, and that is they got 2 units for the lecture and 2 units for the discussion. And no, we had 2 TAs this past year, pardon me. And the TAs conducted the discussions, but I would pop in occasionally. But the 2 and 2 structure was so unwieldy and so nuts that you had half the class enrolling for discussion sections only because that were all the places. That was all that was allowed, so that it became a structural problem. Have I addressed your...
Not really. I mean, there are departments where you'd be lucky to get 20 hours of TAs for your class of 80.
I'm glad. I feel that's necessary in the University of California. I think that it's very important that students and they have teaching assistants. Are you suggesting that how would I do it without teaching assistant help? Well, what would happen would be that it would be straight lecture. It would be the delivery of a commodity. It could be done more efficiently, probably with a laptop computer as a virtual class. Because they could take that class whenever they want, any hour of the day or the night. I would be smaller on there.
What sort of assignments do you use? You mentioned that 3 papers for this class.
I do 3 papers sometimes. Sometimes I've done presentations, but not in class where I ask them to do. Thank you. It really varies. One of the things that is problematic for me is that I want to find a way, and I know that technology can allow this, a way to engage them between those periods of assignments. I mean, I have a mid-quarter, I have a paper, I have a final. And I think that often students in those situations run from one assignment to the next, and they're engaged in bursts. And one of the things I tried this past summer was to have regular online reading journals or chat rooms to keep that engagement going. I told them, I said, you must understand I'm building a cult, and I will require your attention every day. And some of them realized, I said, I'm really joking, you understand. Some of them were not immediately aware of the fact that I was not building a cult.
Right.
But I vary it, and it varies anywhere from a fairly straight-ahead ID exam. The final exam is very much often asks of them a broad question. Imagine that it is the year 2050. You're in a gated compound somewhere in Southern California. Food is scarce. There have been riots. Your community is very unified. There has been a failure of the ability to deliver food, water, and services. What happened? What has been your group's response? And how do you see the future?
That's interesting. So you give them, it's almost like you give them the answer and you say, fill in the gaps between between 2010
Yeah, and I get some wild answers. I mean,
Right.
for example, your group allows them to get into the question of cults. It allows them to deal with gated communities. It allows them to be innovative when they talk about the period of breakdown and decline. Those who want to talk about cannibalism, that allows them to talk about, there was a period in which there was no water and food, and people turned to cannibalism. Invariably, I will see this. And yeah, I think I like the idea of giving them the narrative or giving them the solution, and I ask for the proof.
Right.
I have a question
Of course.
about when you do lecture and then they go to discussion.
Yes.
When you do your lecture,
Yes.
do you also incorporate certain activities pre-lecture, during lecture, to see how much they're following you?
I think
or not.
I think it's difficult to do that within lecture. I think that
Okay.
I find it very difficult to have a discussion component in a lecture of 80 people.
Okay.
Um,
Or an activity, some kind of.
I have found, for example, to break them up into groups. I have not found that very productive. I mean, work in your places.
Or ask a couple of questions.
I always start. I always
okay.
start with saying, these are the three questions we're going to talk about
Oh,
today.
okay.
So I
three
frame the
questions
discussions.
Okay.
But in terms of, I'm never quite satisfied with the fact that they are receiving the knowledge and the information at that point, for the most part. But I've never found personally an effective way to conduct a conversation between 80 people in an hour. Or I've never found an effective way to break them up into groups to do so.
Yeah. I have a strange question for an English professor. How do you grade essays where you have lots of people who were not born in this country, English was not their first language? I'm appalled at some of the essays I get, but I try to read them solely for content. I may flag something, but in general, I let it pass.
I think invariably, if you face a student, we try to identify these students early on. I think that they have to have passed their basic English language ESL, their English language proficiency exam. But I think that whether they are from families in which English may have been a second language or not, you're going to face the challenge of how well this generation of students expresses themselves or writes. I think there's been a decline. I think that it's no longer a book culture, if you will. And I'm not sure that the written word is privileged, other than for managerial or directorial purposes. I mean, I tell my students, you don't need to have to write. You can be a perfectly good engineer, and when you graduate, you'll do great. And in 3 years, they'll get rid of you because your science will have changed, and they can pay somebody new less. They won't have to pay them very many benefits. But the people who survive will be those who can communicate with groups, either through writing or personally, inside the company or outside the company. So really, it's your choice as to whether you want to be a broadly educated person and be able to market your skills, or whether you want to be a narrowly educated person and be as replaceable as an old chip. I think it's a great argument. I also happen to believe it's true, that if you have the ambition as a young technocrat to rise, your ability to communicate is going to be important. I also want to tell you that I just finished grading a batch of papers with my TA, and the best papers were written by non-English majors. Some of the worst were written by English majors, and it was interesting and disheartening.
I end up reading around errors of, spelling and grammar, and I feel I'm failing the university, even though I'm grading my subject matter correctly.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, finally, I think a lot of the battles about the ability to read critically and write effectively, I think a lot of those battles are over with by the time they get out of high school.
I'm talking about juniors and seniors.
I don't like it.
Yeah.
But my own feeling is that, that say in a class I'm doing right now of 77, 80 people, there are 30 different majors. I have to, and it's appropriate, address how effectively they communicate on the page as a piece of writing. Whether they have a thesis, what the overall development of the argument is, how nimbly they can write syntactically, how they can write efficiently. Those are parts of our charge. I mean, because I can't separate what they're saying from how they're saying it. And after all, that is my territory.
Yes.
I can't save their souls, but perhaps I can make them vote. I don't know. And I think that it's rather than being someone who says, oh God, this is happening, in my day students blah, 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 oh please, what a windbag. My own feeling is that I have certain observations and feelings about it, but that comes as part of my charge or our charge.
Two questions. One on the topic you discussed, the earthquake. We had a major earthquake when the part of the Bay Bridge fell down and
Correct.
so forth. So what happened to the delta during that period?
That was an earthquake of the San Andreas Fault, if I remember. And finally, the real concern is the delta is more likely to respond to a slip strike fault on the Hayward Fault that could simply send enough tremors out to cause the levees to percolate, where water would go upward, because a lot of those levees, a lot of the islands in the Delta are privately owned, which means the Army Corps of Engineers has no say over how well the levees are maintained, what they're built out of. And what happens is that if one levee collapses, then the next levee will collapse, so that it's not a question of so much as, it's more a question of how close the earthquake is and how close the epicenter is to the delta and the nature of the quake.
The other question was, since you had been here long enough, Have you seen UC Davis becoming a cult?
Becoming what?
A cult.
Cult.
UC Davis becoming a cult? I don't know. Tell me about that.
Well, because you said when you talked about Jim Jones and his people, people say yes or no, or they all say yes?
Some do and some don't. Some feel, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if UC Davis has become a cult. If it has been, I feel that I have not gotten enough out of it. I want the cult to return certain privileges to me. I want to eat better. I don't want to have to go to the DMV. But I think it's an interesting question as to whether a geopolitical entity can harbor and support certain kinds of social or antisocial behavior. I think it can. I think a state, for example, that passes a law, as some states had, that students can wear their guns to class. That's true. I think that certain kinds of behavior radiate out from that. Somebody did ask me in my class that what would you do if someone brought a gun to class? And I said, first of all, it's a violation of the code of community at UC Davis. It's a violation of the law, and also it's at that point where I leave.
Well, a few years ago, there was an actual case where a policeman was taking a course and his gun fell out and went off. It happened here.
Well, my own feeling is I can't, I mean, for example, Starbucks is in the midst of it. To save my soul, I don't understand why Starbucks needs, I mean, if I'm going to go pay $3.50 for a cup of coffee, I want a comfortable chair, I want something to read, and I want it above all to be safe. And it's interesting to me when a company takes the position that we're taking no position when they know full well they're taking a position. But has UC Davis itself become a cult? I don't see any evidence of it. I think that essentially as a community, intellectuals are far too disorderly to attempt to whip into shape. And I think there's been enough change in terms of administration and charge that I've seen, for example, this university become far less an ag school, far less. Time was the university was essentially a very cheap laboratory for agribusiness. Melon Growers Association might give $1 million to some department on campus, but it would be to look at melon mosaic, which is a particular kind of virus. A one-year study where you'd employ your students to do this. You'd come up with a study, and so that what it meant was the melon growers were paying $1 million, and it would cost them $8 to $10 million had they done that research on their own. So we were a cheap lab. I've seen that sea change utterly since I've been here, that the applied agriculture has become far less the tail that wags the dog. So I think we're too unruly a group culturally to make a cult out of it. And I think also the institution has changed. And I don't think we have a charismatic enough leader. I mean, a cult requires a charismatic leader. It does not require at all a sane leader. Charles Manson, Jim Jones, the people who led the classic California cult that came between Manson and the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate. The people who ran that were completely stark raving nuts. And they taught that behind the comet Hale-Bopp was a mothership that was going to send down small ships to take people back up to the mothership, and you would have to commit suicide to leave the astral plane. And I just thought, whoa.
It is true that it's good if you have a charismatic leader, but there is also something called a reward system.
No, I'm
You
saying
don't need a
in a cult,
charismatic leader for implementing things.
If you wanted to start a cult, I think you really do need to have a charismatic leader. I think that charismatic leaders are extremely dangerous also for any political or social institution. I don't believe that any individual ever redeems or saves anyone. But I've enjoyed this. Good luck. I'll continue to do this. I will let you know my results, and I get a big kick out of seeing these students when I see them when they're fresh to Davis and they're scared to death, and we have to give them lessons on how to use the class website, show them, and I see them 3 years later. It's very interesting to me, or they reappear, how much I've changed and they've changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I invite you all back next week. Our final talk of the quarter will be by Drew Halfman from Sociology.
Thank you.
Hopefully they'll have more to it than